in Sudan. It's all to do with dialogue. That's the main issue of the day. Conversation between leaders who are not seeing eye to eye on one issue or the other. And to help us deliberate on matters mediation, dialogue and reconciliation, I'm joined by Dr. Davis Okombo, who's a human rights advocate. He's joining us from Kisumu County, and we definitely appreciate your time, Dr. Okombo. Perhaps let's begin locally with what's happening in Kenya. And I'm pretty sure you've seen the scenes that have characterized the anti-government protest, or the protest organized to fight against the high cost of living. And the latest news right now is the call for dialogue. Members of the Fourth Estate, members of civil society, churches as well, have called for these leaders to have a sit down and air out their differences. Perhaps your quick reaction to what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, even as calls for dialogue have been the clarion call.
Rogers, it's a pleasure to be back here. I'd like to begin by stating that Article 37 of the Constitution of Kenya makes provisions for the rights of Kenyans to participate in demonstrations and also to present petitions in public places. And this is a constitutional provision. It is not illegal, and it is a right that people are supposed to enjoy in Kenya. As you have stated, in the recent past, there has been demonstrations of the high costs of living in Kenya, and this has escalated into violence and brutal reaction by the law enforcement officers. And the outcome has been an intensified call for dialogue, for negotiation, so that the leaders can come together and sit and try to find solutions to this problem. And I'm here this afternoon to add my voice to the calls for dialogue, that our leaders need to sit down and put the country ahead of their interest, listen to each other, and develop a framework for a peaceful resolution of the political crisis that we face.
Dr. and I don't mean to rain on your parade, but we've definitely seen what can be mentioned as dialogue through the bipartisan talks that were orchestrated by both camps, that's Azimio and Kenya Kwanza. But a few months or a few weeks down the road, I think those talks were suspended. And the last time we had any deliberations was back in May. If you ask Azimio, that train already left the station. The team has been disbanded, and shifting focus to Kenya Kwanza, they're still calling for talks, but within the law. So I beg the question, what exactly will these leaders be talking about that's within the law, that touches on the everyday lives of Kenyan Wananchi, bearing in mind that people took to the streets to protest against the high cost of living? Will a discussion between these two leaders truly sort out the issues that took people to the streets, i.e. the high cost of living?
I'd like to begin by commending our leaders, that is President William Ruto and the Right Honorable Raila Odinga, for agreeing to a bipartisan talk. However, these talks seem to have failed for reasons that both parties are quite aware of. Having said that, let me state that the United Nations call for peaceful resolution of any dispute, not only in Kenya, but the rest of the world. And according to the Manila Declaration on Peaceful Resolution of Conflicts, which was passed in 1982, there are a number of methods that can be used to resolve conflicts. And these include negotiations, inquiry, it also includes mediation, it also includes arbitration and any other peaceful measures that parties can undertake. Therefore, in my view, Kenya, through the bipartisan talks, engaged what we call a negotiation process that brought together the different political parties, that is Azimio and also Kenya Kwanza. But this seemed to have failed, and the next step that we should consider is a mediation that would now include a neutral mediator, and I'm glad that it has been reported that the president of Tanzania, Suluhu, was in the country, although it is alleged that the president failed to meet her, and also President Ramaphosa of South Africa has been mentioned to have shown an interest to lead the mediation process. Now, it has to be stated that in any mediation process, the parties have to agree, and they have to develop a framework that shows the terms of engagement. This has not been done so far, and therefore it is not good and fair when people speculate on the issues that our leaders are going to talk about. But what has come out in the public, as far as the demonstrations that have been led by Azimio, One Kenya Alliance has stated, is about the high cost of living. We know that the current government has embarked on fiscal consolidation, which is aimed at increasing taxes in order to increase the fiscal space in the economy. And this has the likelihood of increasing the cost of living further. And this is one of the issues which I speculate is going to form an agenda of the next mediation process.
Have a sit down, but let's react to the mistrust between these camps that are meant to, sit at the negotiating table. Because just recently we heard from the ODM leader, opposition leader Raila Odinga, mentioning that President Samia Suluhu was in the country in a bid to mediate between President Ruto and himself. Unfortunately, one party was a no-show. So let's speak to the political goodwill that at times is lacking during the mediation process. Do you believe we have the political goodwill in the country, even if we bring in a neutral arbiter to, solve the issues?
If we may make reference to the 2007 post-election violence, and which was mediated through the African Union, eminent leaders like the late Kofi Annan and so on. At that time, the leaders had broken ranks. There was increased polarization in the country, and many people had already lost their lives. That was unprecedented, and you cannot compare it to what is going on currently in Kenya. In spite of that, our leaders, the late President Kibaki and the Right Honorable Raila Odinga, agreed to sit down and talk, and the result, of course, is the grand coalition government that was formed. Having said that, we have to understand that in any political conflict, mistrust is one of the key issues that a mediator has a responsibility to talk about and bring the parties to this conflict together. I think that one of the fears that the hardliners in both parties seem to have is the outcome of the negotiations. Some people feel, unfortunately, that they are going to lose their power and their influence. But I have to state very, very clearly that until now, we do not know what terms of engagement that our leaders are going to put down as an agenda for their discussion. Therefore, I would like to call upon our leaders, especially the Kenya Kwanza team. Please give the president the freedom, give him the chance to participate in a mediation process so that together we can build an inclusive and democratic country called Kenya.
Well, Daktari, and I know you've spoke to the Kenya Kwanza team to perhaps, get off their hardline stances, but that's the reality we're in as a country, where we have the foot soldiers who draw a line in terms of whether negotiations should truly happen or not. And it's been proper to know that, they've written off issues around sharing government and whatnot. But how do you address the hardline stances taken by foot soldiers or members of parliament or people allied to either camp in terms of not wanting negotiations to happen, whichever way possible? How do you deal with hardline stances?
Well, thank you, Jesse. I think, number one, it should be very, very clear to the hardliners that negotiations and mediation is not the same as handshake. As a matter of fact, handshake is an outcome of mediation. It's a mere symbol to demonstrate to the public that the leaders have come together. Now, for those who hold very hardline positions, they have an opportunity to present their views to whatever team that they will agree to come to a mediation committee, and those issues that they would desire to raise would definitely be protected by the very team that they will select. It is important for the hardliners to have confidence in President Ruto and also to have confidence in the Right Honorable Raila Odinga, that these two leaders have the best interest of this country, and that President Ruto is the president for all Kenyans, not a section of Kenya. And therefore it is important in mediation for people to see the ground, for people to accept a win-win situation. They should be able to forego those hardline situations and understand that we have one country called Kenya. Because if we go to war like other African countries have gone before, they would have no country to rule. We need a united country. We need a prosperous country where everyone feels that they belong to this great country called Kenya.
And in terms of that feeling of belonging, and as we finalize on this issue touching on Kenya, for those who vented their frustrations in terms of the high cost of living and whatnot through the protest, how exactly will their issues be, be put on the table in terms of these two gentlemen coming together and talking? In short, what I'm asking is, will a negotiation actually solve the high cost of living in the country that seems to arc very many Kenyans who can't afford, 3 meals per day?
We have to agree that there are a number of factors, both internal and external, that have contributed to the rising cost of living in Kenya. Internally, the government of President Ruto, upon being sworn in, decided to undertake fiscal consolidation, which led to the withdrawal of subsidies on food and fuel and electricity, and also in the Finance Act 2023, which the Court of Appeal would make a determination tomorrow. It has proposed high taxes. This is an effort to increase taxation in the country. However, I believe strongly that the economic advisors of President Ruto will be able to explain to him that when you bring many people to the taxation bracket, then we would be able to have far much revenue that the government can use in their development agenda. And also, the government needs to stop wastage of public resources during these difficult times. I think if we follow such measures, then the question of high cost of living can be addressed, and I believe that if a mediation team is constituted, this is one of the agenda that is affecting every Kenyan that I know, and they are going to give it the necessary priority.
Okay, well noted, Daktari. Let's shift focus briefly to what exactly is happening in Sudan, because this situation in Sudan equally calls for mediation between the two warring generals. And just a status update for viewers in terms of the 3-month-long war that has affected very many Sudanese people, creating a humanitarian crisis in the country and equally in the region as well. Daktari, as you break it down for us in terms of what you've noted from Sudan so far, the international community, the international organizations have a perfect window in terms of ending the war in Sudan. But deliberations have been an issue, and we've heard from some of the generals in Sudan equally calling out the Kenyan President, William Ruto, mentioning that he shouldn't be part of the negotiation table. What do you make of the war in Sudan, number one, and the call for negotiations between the two warring factions?
I'd like to, first of all, indicate that the only way out of the conflict in Sudan is international mediation. The two parties have to come together to a table and talk about the future of Sudan. It should be remembered that unlike Kenya, in Sudan, this is a question of armed conflict where the two armies are in conflict and killing civilian population and so forth, which the international community needs to stand and condemn in the strongest terms possible. It should also be remembered that one of the parties in this war, this paramilitary group, originated from Janjaweed, which was a militia group that the former President Bashir used to kill people in Darfur, and this is a subject of the ICC. So first, it is important for these generals to understand under Article 28 of the Rome Statute what is called the doctrine of command responsibility. After the 1945 war, there was a general in Japan who was convicted, and his conviction was upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States, which stated that this general was not able to control his forces that were killing the civilians. And this has set a precedent which should also be a warning shot to our law enforcement agencies, that if you are not careful and this crisis leads to the ICC, then the IG of the police can be held personally responsible for not restraining the police that kill Kenyans during the protest, and especially here in Kisumu. Secondly, the rejection of President Ruto as a mediator in the Sudanese conflict should not come as a surprise to the people of Kenya. This is because mediation is voluntary. The parties must have full confidence in the person who stands as a mediator. And therefore, if the Sudanese general have legitimate reasons why they should not accept and trust the leadership of Kenya in the mediation process, then the honorable thing for President Ruto to do is to stop being the mediator and allow the Sudanese to accept a mediator that is acceptable to all of them.
Okay, Daktari, as we finalize, there have been progress in terms of negotiations, even though they've been held outside the continent, perhaps speaking about the Jeddah negotiations, which weren't too forthcoming. We've equally seen neighbors of Sudan hosting their own peace-building conferences in Egypt that has has been met by criticism and skepticism in terms of the prospects of success. We've equally seen IGAD, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, equally push a parallel initiative in terms of negotiations. So should we have a one-pronged approach in terms of negotiations? Because dividing and conquering might not apply right now in terms of negotiations. What's your take on that? Should the AU be at the front line in terms of pushing for negotiations, even as other international partners, US, you name it, equally push their weight behind the AU, so we have a one-pronged approach in terms of negotiations? What say you about this?
Well, in the practice of international mediation and negotiation, as I had said earlier, and I now reiterate, the Manila Declaration on Peaceful Settlement of International Disputes provides for different methods of conflict resolution, as I mentioned, like mediation and negotiations and so on. And according to international practices, all these measures are acceptable during a negotiation process. The desired outcome is peaceful resolution of the conflict as opposed to resolution through the use of force. And therefore, any effort that is being undertaken regionally through IGAD, for instance, the African Union, and any other interested parties is welcome, should be nurtured, should be promoted, so that together all these stakeholders would be able to promote peace in this great region of Africa, so that we can have a peace in Sudan. And I should also explain this, which people of Kenya should know. If you take a flight from Europe, for instance, the airspace of Sudan is one of the routes that our commercial planes follow. What do you think will happen if there is an escalation of war and the no-fly zone is proclaimed over Sudan? Then it would really curtail international travel. Therefore, there is an urgency for all the stakeholders, regional and international, to come together and find a possible solution to the crisis in Somalia.
Well noted, Daktari. Thank you so much for your time. Davis Okombo joining us. He's a human rights advocate, helping us put more emphasis on